Ngô Đình Diệm. By mid-1963, South Vietnam was in crisis. The government's repression of Buddhists under Ngô Đình Diệm had triggered mass protests, and discontent was spreading among both civilians and the military. Behind the scenes, a group of South Vietnamese generals, with support from the U.S. Embassy, began preparing for a coup. The plan was largely orchestrated by General Duong Van Minh, with help from other top military leaders. Crucially, they received secret reassurances from the U.S. government, delivered through CIA officer Lucien Conan, that the United States would not intervene to protect Diem. This gave the plotters confidence to move forward, and on November 1, 1963, the coup began. Diem and his brother held out in the presidential palace, but by evening they had fled through a hidden tunnel and took refuge in a Catholic church in Cholon. The next morning, November 2nd, South Vietnamese soldiers found the brothers and took them into custody. As they were being transported in the back of an armored personnel carrier, they were assassinated by Captain Nguyen Van Hung, allegedly under direct orders from General Minh. Diem was shot and stabbed, and his body was later buried in an unmarked grave. North Vietnam was shocked the Americans had backed such a move, with their president, Ho Chi Minh, saying, "I can scarcely believe the Americans would be so stupid," and saying that the assassination would destabilize the South for years to come. Muammar Gaddafi. After protests broke out in Libya in February 2011, part of the wider Arab Spring, Gaddafi responded with force. His government dismissed the opposition as extremists and accused them of being under foreign influence. Despite efforts to ease tensions through food subsidies and some prisoner releases, protests spread, particularly in the east. When the military opened fire on protesters, support for Gaddafi began to collapse. Parts of the army and government defected, and eastern cities including Benghazi fell under rebel control. In response, the National Transitional Council was formed to represent opposition forces. The situation escalated into a civil war, and both sides were accused of abuses. In March, the UN authorized a no-fly zone, which was enforced by NATO to prevent air attacks on civilians. Several countries, including France, Qatar, and the UAE, provided support to the rebels. NATO airstrikes played a key role in shifting the balance of power, and over time, the NTC forces with air support pushed westward. In August, they captured Tripoli, and by October, only a few cities remained under Gaddafi's control, including Sirte, where he had taken refuge. On October 20th, 2011, Gaddafi tried to flee Sirte in a convoy, but it was hit by a NATO airstrike. He survived the strike and hid in a drainage pipe nearby, where he was eventually captured by rebel fighters. During the capture, he was beaten and wounded. While the official explanation stated he was killed in crossfire, other sources indicated he may have been shot after being captured. Gaddafi's body was later displayed in Misrata, and on October 25th, he was buried in an undisclosed desert location. Park Chung-hee. By the late 1970s, South Korea's President Park Chung-hee was losing public support. Although his early years were known for the strong economic growth, his increasingly authoritarian rule, especially under the Yushin Constitution, which was a highly authoritarian document that significantly expanded the powers of the president in South Korea, caused unrest to grow. South Koreans were frustrated by strict limits on freedom of speech, a powerful and feared security agency, the KCIA, and widespread arrests without trial. So much so that protests escalated in October 1979. Especially in Busan and Masan, where thousands of students and workers clashed with police, prompting martial law in parts of the country. Just days after these protests, on October 26, 1979, Park was having dinner with Kim Jae-gyu, the director of the KCIA, at a government safe house in Seoul. Out of nowhere, Kim shot Park in the head and chest. Other KCIA agents helped by killing members of Park's security elsewhere in the building. When asked why he did this, Kim claimed he acted out of patriotism, saying Park was blocking democratic progress. Kim was tortured, put on trial, and executed in May 1980. Park's death triggered a power vacuum, as Choi Kyu-ha became acting president, but Chun Do-hwan quickly took control of the military and intelligence services. By 1980, Chun had effectively taken over the government in another military coup. Anastasio Somoza Debayle. By the late 1970s, Anastasio Somoza Debayle, who ruled over Nicaragua, was one of the most powerful men in Central America, but also one of the most widely opposed, especially from the Sandinista National Liberation Front. After a series of escalating crises, including a deadly earthquake in 1972, accusations of theft, and a violent crackdown on protesters, the opposition started becoming stronger and stronger. In July 1979, with armed Sandinista forces advancing and U.S. support withdrawn under President Jimmy Carter, Somoza resigned and fled the country. He first went to Miami, but was denied asylum in the United States and eventually settled in Paraguay, which at the time was under the dictatorship of Alfredo Stroessner. A little more than a year later, on September 17, 1980, a 7-person Sandinista commando team, in an operation called Operation Reptile, ambushed his vehicle on Avenida España. The team had spent over 6 months preparing, tracking his movements and planning the attack. As Somoza drove past the ambush site, the team attempted to strike his car with an RPG-7. The first shot misfired, but the second hit the vehicle directly. Somoza was killed instantly, along with his driver and financial advisor, and reports said his body was so badly burned that he was identified through his feet. Some later accounts suggested Cuban intelligence played a role in planning the assassination, given Somoza's long history of opposing Fidel Castro's regime. Rafael Trujillo. During the late 1950s, Rafael Trujillo's dictatorship in the Dominican Republic was increasingly isolated. The attempted assassination of Venezuelan President Romulo Betancourt in 1960, orchestrated by Trujillo's intelligence agency, triggered international outrage. The Organization of American States imposed sanctions, and the United States distanced itself from the regime. On May 30, 1961, Trujillo was outside Santo Domingo when his car was ambushed on a coastal highway by a group of conspirators, including military officers and civilians. Some of the attackers were longtime allies who had turned against him. The operation succeeded in killing Trujillo, but the group failed to seize power afterward, as General René Roman, expected to support the coup, hesitated and took no action. In the days that followed, Trujillo's son Ramfis returned from Paris to take control. Backed by SIM, the secret police, the regime launched a brutal crackdown. Dozens of people were arrested, tortured, or killed. 6 of the assassins were executed in what became known as the Hacienda Maria massacre. After all of this, however, by late 1961, Ramfis Trujillo left the country, taking his father's remains to Spain. Trujillo's assassination, however, had broader implications. The CIA had supplied weapons to the plotters, and declassified documents later showed that U.S. officials debated supporting the rebels. Although some reports claimed the agency only had faint connections to the assassination, later investigations revealed deeper U.S. involvement, including ties to those groups and attempts to influence the transition after Trujillo's death. Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. By the late 1980s, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini had been ruling Iran as its supreme leader for a full decade. In that time, he'd turned the country into a theocratic state, suppressed opposition, fought a devastating 8-year war with Iraq, and issued one of the most infamous fatwas in modern history, the call to assassinate author Salman Rushdie. But by 1989, Khomeini himself was deteriorating. He suffered from heart problems and had already been hospitalized more than once. But in May 1989, things took a critical turn. Over the course of 10 days, he suffered 5 heart attacks. He was taken to the hospital, and after 11 days of treatment, it became clear that even with the best care available, his condition was beyond recovery. On June 3, 1989, at the age of 86, Ayatollah Khomeini died. But something crazy happened after his death. Millions of Iranians poured into the streets to mourn him. The state declared a national mourning period, and huge crowds formed across Tehran and beyond. It was summer, temperatures were high, and to keep the crowd from collapsing under the heat, fire trucks sprayed water into the streets. Even so, the crowds were so dense that at least 10 people were trampled to death, and over 400 more were badly injured. During his funeral, as the helicopter carrying his coffin landed at the cemetery, the crowd lost control. People surged past the security barricades, and some of them rushed the coffin, pulled it from the helicopter, and began parading it around. In the chaos, the body itself fell out of the coffin. Khomeini's son Ahmad was even knocked to the ground as mourners tried to get close enough to touch the shroud. The scene became so bad that soldiers had to fire warning shots to disperse people and reclaim the body. Eventually, the authorities aborted the burial and took the body away to regroup. That evening, a second funeral was held, this time with tight security and a steel coffin to prevent any further problems. Slobodan Milošević. After years of being at the center of the brutal wars in the Balkans, Slobodan Milošević ended up in a prison cell at The Hague. In 1999, during the Kosovo War, he became the first sitting head of state to be indicted for crimes against humanity by the UN's International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. By the time his trial began in 2002, the list of accusations was huge, with war crimes across Croatia, Bosnia, and Kosovo. Milošević refused a lawyer and defended himself, and the prosecution spent 2 years presenting evidence. It was harder and it went on for longer than expected. But suddenly, in March 2006, before the trial could end, Milošević was found dead in his cell in The Hague. An autopsy confirmed that he had died of a heart attack. He had long suffered from heart problems and high blood pressure, and shortly before his death, the tribunal had denied his request to receive treatment at a cardiology clinic in Russia. His death sparked controversy because some believed the tribunal had been negligent by refusing him outside medical care, while others suspected he might have knowingly contributed to his own death by misusing medication. Either way, he died before any verdict was reached. But later rulings from the tribunal concluded that Milošević was part of a joint criminal enterprise that used violence and forced displacement to try to move certain ethnicities, such as Croats, Bosniaks, and Kosovo Albanians. Idi Amin. Idi Amin, one of the most brutal dictators in modern world history who ruled over Uganda, was overthrown in April 1979, fleeing by helicopter as Tanzanian forces and Ugandan exiles closed in on Uganda's capital. He first went to Libya, then Saudi Arabia, where the royal family gave him asylum on the condition that he stay out of politics. However, even in exile, he remained controversial. In 1989, he tried to secretly return to Africa using a false passport, hoping to raise a rebel army to retake Uganda, which was then in the middle of another civil war. But he was quickly recognized and arrested in Congo. After being bounced between countries, he was eventually allowed back into Saudi Arabia, but only after promising not to engage in politics again. He then decided to lay low, living relatively quietly with part of his large family. On the 19th of July 2003, one of his wives announced that he was in a coma and near death from kidney failure. She asked Uganda's president to allow him to return home to die, but the request was rejected. Amin died on the 16th of August 2003 in Jeddah, as his family decided to remove him from life support. He was buried in a simple grave at Ruwais Cemetery in Jeddah, with no official ceremony or honors. Ferdinand Marcos. In late 1985, Ferdinand Marcos called for a snap election to try and keep control as more and more people were unhappy with his rule and foreign allies were pressuring him. The government declared Marcos the winner, but many believed the election was rigged. Reports of cheating and violence led to mass protests and a military-backed uprising known as the People Power Revolution. On February 25, 1986, Marcos held his own swearing-in ceremonies. But with the protests growing and some top military officials switching sides, he was forced to flee the country. The United States helped fly him, his family, and close allies to Hawaii, and while living there, Marcos stayed in a large house and continued to live comfortably, even as hundreds of cases were filed against him in the US for corruption and stealing money from the Philippines. Later, it came out that Marcos had tried to plan a return to power. He even talked about trying to kidnap Aquino, his main political opponent, but the US stopped him. Marcos got pneumonia in early 1989 and died on September 28 that year, and before he died, he said he was willing to return most of his wealth in exchange for being buried back in the Philippines, but the government refused, so he remained in Honolulu. His body was eventually returned to the Philippines in 1993 and kept in a refrigerated crypt in Ilocos Norte for over 2 decades. However, in 2016, under President Rodrigo Duterte, his remains were controversially reburied at the Heroes Cemetery with military honors, sparking protests from groups opposing his authoritarian rule. Ante Pavelić. After World War II, Ante Pavelić, the fascist dictator of the Nazi puppet state known as the Independent State of Croatia, went on the run. His regime had collapsed alongside the Axis powers, and Yugoslavia wanted him extradited for war crimes, but Pavelić escaped, at least for a while. His post-war journey was long and twisted. He disguised himself as a Catholic priest, traveled on a Peruvian passport, and was sheltered in Vatican properties in Rome under fake names like Don Pedro Goner. With help from contacts like Father Krunoslav Draganović, Pavelić managed to stay hidden in Italy until 1948, when he finally fled across the Atlantic to Argentina under another alias, Pablo Aranjos. He eventually worked as a security advisor to President Juan Perón, and he even started a construction company thanks to political connections. Despite his past, Pavelić lived somewhat openly and began building a new political movement among Croatian exiles, trying to revive the idea of a fascist Croatian state. But not everyone had forgotten what he'd done. On April 10, 1957, the anniversary of the founding of his fascist state, a man named Blagoje Jovović, a former Royal Yugoslav officer and Serbian nationalist, ambushed Pavelić outside a bus in the Buenos Aires suburb of El Palomar. Jovović shot him twice, in the back and collarbone, and one of the bullets lodged dangerously close to Pavelić's spine. Though Pavelić survived the attack, it marked the beginning of the end. His identity was exposed at the hospital, and with the fall of Perón's government, the Argentine authorities became much more cooperative with Yugoslavia's extradition request. Realizing that time was running out, Pavelić checked himself out of the hospital, still carrying a bullet in his body, and fled to Chile, then to Spain. From there, he continued leading the Croatian liberation movement from the shadows and issued messages urging Croats to re-establish an independent Croatian state, but his body was failing. The wounds from the 1957 assassination attempt never fully healed, and by late 1959, his condition had worsened significantly. On December 28, 1959, Ante Pavelić died in Madrid at the Hospital Alemán, officially from complications related to the bullet wounds he had carried for over 2 years. He was 70 years old. If you liked this video, subscribe for similar ones or join my Discord to suggest another.